Hi there. My name is Ros Williams, and I'm a sociologist from the University of Sheffield in the UK. And I'd like to thank the Donor Research Network for inviting me to speak at this symposium. This paper is one piece of work emerging from a research project that I started back in September 2019, funded by the Wellcome Trust in the UK. Now, the talk regards what I've been thinking and writing about as an ethico-racial imperative, the idea that in recruitment work, both ethics and race become entangled in important and potentially quite problematic ways that I think it's important to think through. Before I jump into that, though, I wanted to flag that my professional background is as a sociologist, which means I'm interested less in issues like donation behaviours and means of analysing, measuring and trying to change them, and that I'm more interested in the social underpinnings of how, whether, and in what ways, both as individuals and as communities, people come to learn about and engage with systems and practices of donation, which offers a useful way into thinking about how inequalities aren't just something that practitioners try to address, but might also be introduced into our very practices of redress. Now, themes from this paper have been published in 2 open access articles, both of which are available online and which I'll give details for at the end of the talk. But before I jump into the argument I wanted to make today, I thought it would be useful for those who are less familiar with the specific area of stem cell transplantation and donation, just to give a quick and brief overview of what that area looks like and what's happening in it. So bone marrow stem cell transplant is an established treatment option for blood malignancies, including a range of illnesses like blood cancers and other kinds of blood malignancies like sickle cell disease and various anemias like aplastic anemia and rarer diseases too. And the science relies on matching between donor and patient at a genetic level. The idea is that somebody as genetically similar to the patient is likely to be their best donor. Now, relatedness is a really key kind of conceptual fulcrum here. Recipient and donor compatibility is measured by tissue, which is inherited. And in fact, much of the early work in mapping genetic types around the world used calculations like coefficients of kinship, a visualization of which you can see on the bottom left there. If you need a match, you might find it in your full biological sibling. But if not, it's thought that you're most likely to find it within your own population group, which, if zoomed into enough, is thought to look sort of like a large ancestral network. The search begins on the stem cell registry, which is a big database of the genetic data of people who have agreed to volunteer as a potential stem cell donor. Now, in the UK, we have a few registries which are aligned with our National Health Service, but mainly the registries are charity run. And around the world, there are lots of registries, I believe nearly 100 at the moment. Now, going back to the idea of population, the idea is often used interchangeably with ideas like race and ethnicity in the field, and these become, in a sense, metonymic. You'll often see claims on registry websites, and in the work I look at and what follows, that patients are most likely to find their donor in somebody of the same ethnic background as them. Race, as geographer Catherine Nash argues, can thus be framed as a degree of relatedness. Now, the story gets even more complicated when we look at the wider demographic composition of the registries. Here, this becomes a story of underrepresentation, something that many will be familiar with, I'm sure. Of around 40 million stem cell donors worldwide, the issue here is around representation of racial and ethnic minorities. So amongst the registries in the global north, there are far fewer donors of ethnic minority background. Given what I've just noted, this tends to mean that ethnic minority patients are less likely to find compatible matches. In the UK, a frequently quoted statistic would be something like 90% of white patients versus only 40% of minority ethnicity patients are able to find a match on the registry. A lot of work is now then being done to try and engage minority people as stem cell donors. And this work is the focus of what follows in this presentation. And just a quick note on the language that I'm going to be using in this presentation, particularly around race and ethnicity. Sociologists of race and ethnicity note an enduring disagreement amongst researchers about what is subsumed into these different terms. So race can often be associated with phenotypic and biological grouping, and ethnicity is often associated with cultural grouping. People like Bob Carter and Simon Dyson, the sociologists of race and ethnicity, point to a tendency often in policy and academic and public discourses, at least in the UK, to use terms like ethnicity to discuss certain qualities in people without having to employ quote unquote disreputable notions of race. And similar insights have been made in the broader European context as well, people like Ahmad Umcharek and colleagues, wherein race is seen as an absent presence, obfuscated by coding of race in discursive other terms, such as religion, nature, and culture. And indeed, the terms race and ethnicity are used really interchangeably in the field of interest to me. As such, I don't clearly distinguish the terms in the way many of us often do, since they both in this context seem to gesture toward this idea of there being a genetic difference between different groups of people. So I thought it would just be useful just to kind of give a quick run through of some of the literature that has shaped my thinking and what follows. The intersections of race and relatedness in different biomedical contexts have been the focus of a really interdisciplinary discussion in geography, anthropology, sociology, and elsewhere. And I'm not sure that anyone has the inclination for me to rehearse all of that literature now, and you can read the journal articles that I'll cite at the end of this presentation if you want to learn more about it. But some key names are folks like Paul Rabinow, pictured there on the left with a bookshelf and a hat. Originally, he proposed this idea of biosociality. And biosociality was being used to describe how people coalesce around knowledge produced through genomics. And he was writing in the early 1990s, and he was interested in how people are united and propelled into action through genomic information. And he didn't think it was unthinkable that new socialities would gather around this allele or that chromosomal omission, often in a bid to end illnesses like rare diseases. Now, new cultural classifications emerging from such technologies would, he suggested, cross-cut or even supersede our older categories like ones of race. Yet, as is acknowledged by others, actually, older categories like racial classification based on race and kinship both inform and provide the framework for new kinds of biological identities, which is to say that race and racialized communities as ideas in the context of science haven't gone anywhere, but they've been made and remade through contemporary biological knowledge. And indeed, relatedness and kinship have an enduring connection to our understandings of race. We can think about this in the work of science and technology scholars like Donna Haraway, who talks about the relationship between ideas of family, inheritance, and what she calls the apparently great organic nested collectives of race. The intersections of race and relatedness precede and now proliferate alongside technologies that have advanced, like, for example, direct-to-consumer genetic tests, which arguably open up or perhaps close down the idea of what constitutes an ancestor. And much of this literature traces how a sense of relatedness is being produced through creative practice. So as Peter Wade puts it, kinship has an enduring connection to our understandings of race and is created through both genealogical connection and cultural performance, in which particular ways of feeling relatedness or kinship are performed, dramatic, or choreographed to engender affect or emotion in an audience. Going back to ancestry testing, actually, a really good example of this would be in the work of someone like Alondra Nelson, also pictured on the left there next to a bookshelf. In her work, she describes how ancestry testing amongst African Americans demonstrated how results could prove or disprove a suspected ancestry, unknown because of the forced displacement of enslaved ancestors. Customers, she notes, would often record a YouTube video revealing their ancestry live on camera with theatrical flair, as she puts it. And there's a still from one of those videos on the left there. Now, these normative underpinnings also have a kind of an ethical orientation to them by linking identity to action. As Catherine Nash notes, alongside disrupting or asserting claims to collective identity, so for example, my ancestry test demonstrates I'm part of this group, these socialities also generate networks of obligation, in part through highlighting relatedness and the responsibilities entangled in having relationships. And this is particularly evident when biomedically asserted claims to relatedness are mobilized to prompt participation in specific projects, such as tissue donation or clinical trials. So, for example, in my work with Sabine Mers, we argue that such efforts are often underwritten by claims that suffering within a racialized racially minoritized community is directly exacerbated by a lack of those communities' participation. So, for example, the claim that if African Americans don't take part in this trial, we won't know how effective the treatment will be on African Americans. And this necessarily frames participation in biomedical projects as the ethical decision. Now, importantly, the work to attract participation is often undertaken by people located within that community of interest. So scholars like Stephen Epstein's work on recruitmentology explores the training of trial participants to recruit further participants from within their communities. He argues that this constitutes a particular social episteme, wherein that which becomes not simply knowable but recruitable is not the individual but the group to which they belong. And use the examples of ambassadors, Latina study participants who were trained to recruit fellow Latinas to the study. So the point I want to make here is that participation in such projects can be underwritten by claims to heavily racialized biosociality, obligation, and duty, what I describe as an ethico-racial imperative. Ethical in that a specifically normative framed course of action is emphasized, and racial in that a specific set of individuals focused on because of their racial identity are the audience of that imperative. And employing this imperative can actually have its own set of ethical considerations that it's important, I think, for practitioners who do recruitment to take notice of. So in what follows, I'll try and explain what it is I mean. So the following is based on an analysis of grey literature, including documents and reports from UK-based policymakers and stem cell registries, interviews with so far 17 registry workers, recruitment charity workers, and those involved in individual patient appeals, and participant observation of donor drives in various locations in the UK with two organisations who you may have heard of, the African Caribbean Leukemia Trust and Race Against Blood Cancer, who were two UK-based charities working to increase stem cell registration amongst the UK's racially minoritized population. Their logos are there, and if you search them, you can learn lots about their work. Of course, fieldwork plans collapsed overnight, given coronavirus affected a lot of the research that I was planning to overtake. So we'll be drawing as well on a range of analysis of social media campaigns for individuals who are seeking matches. And this includes a set of tweets and Facebook posts from these campaigns, as well as analysis of a range of media coverage and blogs written on campaign websites. And just to mention that I do have permission to identify and mention names where people have been named. And I do have permission from the patient or the family in that case to do so. So first, I want to kind of lay out the parameters of what it is I mean by putting the words ethical and racial together with imperative in this way. And to do that, I think it's actually quite useful to start with policy from the UK context. So in the UK, stem cell donor recruitment is most recently be talked about in this policy document here. In this document, it suggests that non-scientific actors of ethnic minority backgrounds are framed as particularly effective in generating engagement in ethnic minority communities. The latest parliamentary review, this one, Ending the Silent Crisis in 2018, emphasizes the role of organizations working within racialized communities. And in the policy document, they say the rate of donor recruitment by what in the UK they term BAME, Black, Asian and minority ethnic grassroots and community organizations, is high. Grassroots and community organizations' knowledge of respective target audiences and their dissociation from government institutions generates higher levels of trust for BAME groups, and this allows them to reach underrepresented communities more effectively. The message of the framing might be accurate, but its effectiveness is dependent on the messenger and the mode of delivery. So the argument here is that community organizations are valuable for their perceived capacity to generate trust, due in part from being not part of government, essentially. So these organizations are then best placed to communicate with so-called target audiences, and we can infer that their value hinges then on their own members' racial positioning. It's less the message to be seen at issue than the messenger, which is to say that, for example, there's an understanding here that if you are a Black audience, you're going to feel more compelled by a message from a Black speaker, for example, than perhaps you would from somebody who didn't share your ethnic identity. This, I think, is the implication the inference that I draw from this kind of speech. So there's a sense in the work that I want to explore here that sharedness of identity is basically something that people are trying to foster through recruitment work. And we very often see this in patient appeals. And I just want to give you one example here of a patient appeal where this is being done. This is news coverage from a campaign for a young boy called Veer, who requires but cannot find a stem cell donor. So I show this one here just to demonstrate how a shared racial identity is being enacted in his appeal work. Now, in a video that he recorded for the campaign, the British Asian actor Dev Patel, who you might recognise from Slumdog Millionaire, he invites viewers to register as donors to help this young boy. Now, a gentle plucked guitar soundtrack overlays this video with the campaign's website and social media handles presented neatly on the screen. And Patel moves in and out of shot as text appears on the screen, telling Veer's story. As you can see in this GIF here, Patel sits on the sofa and looks directly at us. His voice is earnest, it is slow, and it is very sober as he explains, quote, "There are hardly any donors of Asian origin in the UK, and that is why I'm talking to you guys today. We need to raise awareness within our communities and around the world." Notice in this example, and across the others to follow, how Patel is delineating the community of interest to him. A mutual identity is mobilized here between the individual in need, Veer, on the left of the screen, the asker, Patel, on the right of the screen, and the asked, South Asians. It's demonstrative of how race is framed as a collective, so our communities, how engaging with stem cell registration is framed as a need, the word that he's using, and also of the doing of kinship, to think back to the literature that I introduced you to. This is all embodied in the video's composition. Veer's personal story is being told. The seriousness of his situation is echoed through the actor's very solemn delivery. Now, the campaigns and organisations discussed here emerge around specific patients requiring a stem cell donor, who place, or their families place, their inability to find their match on their own race. As such, the work undertaken has to be understood as a response to a highly personal, familial issue refracted through the explanatory lens of race. In short, most people, I think, who come to recruitment work, certainly informal recruitment work like this, are doing that because they've been personally affected by the issue that they're trying to redress here, which is underrepresentation on the registries, and they're directly affected by that. Now, I just want to add then a little texture to the point I'm trying to make here, which is that there is a sense in which relatedness, not just at the family scale, but at the scale of race, comes into play in these appeals. So take, for example, a campaign to locate a match for a young woman called Lara, a campaign that you may have heard of. Much of the publicity was driven by and featured her family. And in one tweet sent out by a stem cell registry, people are invited to, quote, "Watch Lara's mum explain why we're urging those with a mixed ethnicity in particular to register." The tweet links to a YouTube video of a donor drive run by the campaign. And as with the video of the Help Veer Now campaign that I just showed you, a gentle guitar track fills the audio between words, and the video pans tables populated with the sort of ephemera of swabs and registration forms that you would expect at a donor drive like this. Lara's mother comes into shot and explains that they expect to find Lara's donor in the pool of what she describes as minority and mixed race donors. She says, "Hi, I'm Lara's mother, and we're here today to get people onto the donor registry. Lara, my daughter, has leukemia and she needs a stem cell donor urgently. Doctors have advised that the match is likely to be found in minority and mixed race communities. It's really easy and safe to register. You could save a life, and that is why we're here today. Please join a local drive or sign up online." It's notable that this appeal mobilizes an apparently stable category that might be targeted. Here, minority and mixed race communities, even though the notion of mixed is itself an inherently unstable and arguably quite diffuse category. More so, I think, than the community of interest to say the Veer campaign of the previous slides of South Asians. It serves to exemplify how across these examples, a racialized subject is being enacted. Indeed, a community is being constructed so that an appeal can be made to them. In this case, family, daughter and mother are at the heart of this, but the entire racial community, insofar as these statements bring it into existence, are being mobilized as possible helpers. Take another instance. One day I'm at a donor drive run by the African Caribbean Leukemia Trust at a Pentecostal church in London. The charity's founders, two Black Londoners, initially began campaigning to locate a match for their own child. You cannot see too clearly, but this is some swabs that are a photo that was taken of a kind of a batch of swabs on a desk at a registration drive, just to give you a sense of the sort of milieu I was in when I was observing this. But at this drive, volunteers are stood behind the table populated with registration forms and swabs like the ones here. And the founder gives a presentation to the congregation in the hall. And he speaks very slowly as he treads the stage and makes eye contact with audience members. And he says this: be a positive role model to your community. Be a positive role model to your race. From today, who knows what might happen? One of the people who sign up later to be a stem cell donor could be a lifesaver. He very soberly states, time is running out for people, especially our people. I locate in his words an effort to create at once both race and relatedness. This capacity to make a weighty appeal is drawn here in part from his own Blackness. Like with Dev Patel's appeal to our collective community of Asians, the shared identity between audience and speaker seems to be assumed. He can talk to his community or his audience with collective nouns, our people, that somebody, I think, without his skin color would not be able to. And the appeal is also founded upon narratives of family, of bereavement and suffering that also orbit around an act, donor registration, that stands to mitigate that suffering. So in this case, his speeches generally give a story about their lost child, and that is used as a kind of a narrative arc that compels people to join the registry. Now, throughout these examples, I've tried to draw in moments from ethnographic observation from the field, as well as elements of individual appeals. And I would argue that they work hard through this work to foster a sense in their audiences, both physical and virtual, of shared community. And within that, a sense of shared and mutual duty of care to act. And very often this work operates through storytelling, but the stories being told here are more often than not ones of illness or even loss. My son, my daughter, myself, a person given a prognosis of only so long to live, who's having to go through difficult treatments, images of which might be shared to cultivate that sense of beauty in an audience. And by design, the sharing attempts to reach as far and as wide as possible to anybody who will listen. So consider just one example that I want to give before I close up. A young woman I interviewed has been the subject of an appeal that ended upon reaching a very extensive audience of people. And she tells a story of being recognized and feeling really uncomfortable with that. I'll read it out. I'm a very private person. I don't have any social media. So having my face plastered everywhere, my dentist would recognize me. And everywhere I go, somebody was like, oh, I saw your thing on Facebook. My family were going crazy, posting it everywhere. So for me personally, I felt really horrible. I hated it because I was going through a really rubbish time in my life. I didn't look great. I felt really chubby. I didn't want to have that attention. There's a time in your life when you want to hibernate, and I couldn't. During that time, I thought, okay, my father's going to all of these fairs and trying to get people to join up, so I'll help and be the poster child there and try and get people to join up. But it's all written in stone now. So if anybody in the future looks me up online, she's talking about here, it's just going to come up with all of the appeal material. Her story, which is not unique actually amongst those I've spoken to as part of this research, points to the ethical problematic of much of this approach to recruitment work, which relies on extensive storytelling. And I think it should prompt us to give pause about the calculus of exposure for those whose stories get told to try and prompt recruitment. For charity workers who may be used to telling their stories of loss again and again, we might ask, what strength does it take for that? But for appeals set up in the hope that a match will be found for the individual who is the subject of that appeal, we might ask, are patients and families really given the foreknowledge of the costs and challenges of actually doing that work? Are they prepared for the reality, which is that they will become, if the appeal is supposedly successful, highly, highly visible? So in summary, the appeals considered here are specific efforts to generate not only a mutual racial affiliation, but also a sense of responsibility. And this happens across different examples of appeals to people of ostensibly different racial backgrounds. This paper has centralized some of the creative elements that are combined in this generative pursuit. And it's also highly normative work, and that it explicitly encourages a specific pathway of action. And in this way, appeals to engage in biomedical projects can be made on the grounds of both race and moral action, which I've termed here an ethico-racial imperative. But it's important to recognize that this is the case, because it surfaces how recruitment efforts perhaps always rely on trying to establish a community to whom the appeal is being made. Communities don't just exist out in the wild to tap into, but they're being actively constructed to recruit them. These are efforts that try, through what is said, how it is said, and who it is said, and who is saying it, to delineate who it is they're talking to and what they want them to do. Now, it's widely accepted that access to stem cell transplant is limited, and that this limitation plays out along racial lines. And ameliorating this lack of access is framed in UK policy as a highly specialised job. It's seen as a task for people of ethnic minority who are thought more effective to be placed into conversation with their communities. Now, the work of articulating this imperative, though, is generally undertaken by individuals who express having no alternative other than to act in this way, as there is nobody else there to do this work on their behalf. These people may well be very vulnerable. They themselves are ill or caring for somebody else who's unwell, or they're grieving for a lost loved one, and yet they decide to share their story, very often, again and again, to an audience, or indeed anybody that they hope will listen, perhaps via social media or other kinds of traditional media. And in this way, and this is the point I really want to end on here, because I know that some kind of recruitment practitioners will be listening today. The evidence being collected by this study on which this presentation rests would, I think, support taking very seriously the manner in which stories and the families and individuals telling them are mobilized in recruitment efforts that are in effect trying to generate and construct community, because stories are seen as such an effective way of doing that. And indeed, though they can be highly effective in fostering a sense of racialized community and driving people to action through the mobilization of that ethico-racial imperative, as I call it, they can have costs beyond the immediate, let's say, spike in donor registrations, costs to the individuals themselves. And in this way, I think considering the kind of this approach to recruitment work that really relies on narrative might think of itself in terms of the welfare or the safeguarding needs of the people telling that story, and thinking about how that is perhaps an under-acknowledged priority in the area of stem cell donor recruitment, but also related areas like other forms of tissue donor recruitment. I'll leave that there, and I'll say thank you very much for listening. The ideas that are being explored in the presentation I just gave are also available to read in more detail into open access journal articles. If you just search these on Google, it's harder for the likes of us. Racially minoritized stem cell donation as ethico-racial imperative. You can read about the arguments there, but also in this second paper here on the right as well, improving the odds for everybody, narrative and media in stem cell donor recruitment, patient appeals, and the work to address racial inequity. If you like a summary of either of those papers, because perhaps you don't have time to read them all, you can also visit the website from this project, www.mixandmatch.blog, or you can reach out to me via email or via Twitter. Thank you very much indeed for listening.